I'm Laurence Llewelyn-Bowen, and I'm offering the world, and indeed you, guided tours of the history, culture, and alchemy of interior design. This time, I'd like us to try and ascertain why it is we've spent the last 2,000 years craving the classical. When you think about it, there's one design brand that is, above all the others, the most recognised, the most revered, the most regurgitated. Humanity is hooked on classics and can't seem to wean itself off. Brand Roman is such a successful, such a dominant design statement that nearly every empire since the Roman Empire has used its supersized styling to get the point across. There were the Austro-Hungarians, the Spanish, the Brits, the Soviets, the Nazis, the communists, the fascists of more or less every flavour, and McDonald's. You know where you are with classicism, because it comes with a wonderfully detailed instruction manual, a fully comprehensive self-assembly guide that means that architecturally you don't have to think for yourself. If you don't want to, that is. It boasts a number of highly collectible design icons that can be just as comprehensively read by the illiterate as the educated, and top of the classical pops has to be the column. Sure, okay, every ancient civilization had the column. The minute you started to build your own shelter outside the warm, fuggy safety of the cave, you're going to need something to hold up a roof of twigs and branches, aren't you? In fact, the ancient, the historical, is architecturally hardwired into the temples of both the Egyptians and the Greeks. They used the most sophisticated techniques to give their columns decorative references that alluded backwards in time. It's always fun column spotting in the suburbs, and you can always spot a hard-working family that's breaking through the blue-collar barrier by what they choose to do to the outside of their home. And 9 times out of 10, it's pop some columns up. Columns say one thing loud and clear. Columns say posh. So it's a bit of a shame the Roman Empire ended up declining and falling, really. And it wasn't just the hairy wave of Angles, Saxons and Jutes overturning the infrastructure. It actually lost its mojo when Emperor Constantine moved it lock, stock and barrel vault to, well, Constantinople. And becoming Christian didn't help. Before, the most important thing in the state was the state. Now, the most important thing in the state was the afterlife you pre-booked with God's ornately robed booking agents, the priesthood. Comfort, cushions, exquisitely carved statues, sophisticated comedies and well-washed bottoms, well, they started to be condemned as worldly distractions, seductions that perverted the soul towards the primrose path of pleasure, when it really should be gritting its teeth to ascend the rocky road to redemption. Deliberately, spitefully, all the wonderful polish the Romans had used to buff their world to a high shine got scraped away. Buildings became lumpen barns with tiny windows, statues misshapen, squat and googly-eyed, and worst of all, human existence, once celebrated for its fragrant pleasures, got made over to become a miserable veil of tears, something to be endured rather than enjoyed. And that's kind of what faced Christians for the next 1,000 years, more or less. But in the Middle East, Islam, which had only just sprung into fresh and vigorous existence, had a much more tolerant attitude to the Roman leftovers it inherited as it gobbled up Rome's former colonies. Sure, Islam was very anti-graven image, so statues were a no-no, but so much of Rome's technological, scientific, architectural legacy tucked neatly into Islamic culture. In the East, the column continued to be a miracle of decorative delicacy, whilst in the West, it de-evolved into an object of elephantine blobbiness. It's always too tempting to see the Renaissance as a light switch, an overnight sensation when the darkness, the dirt, the degradation, and the dementors of the Middle Ages get instantly banished by the light of reignited civilization. When you look at Italy in the medieval period, you'll see a society, actually, in fact, a series of societies, all of whom are keeping close to their hearts faint echoes of the classical. For a start, there aren't kings like everywhere else. It's a patchwork of city-states that are republics or autocracies, all of whom are using a political language which is inspired by what they can dimly remember from their ancient Roman pasts. Meanwhile, architecture and art both fail to flower in the brutal off-centre Gothicism that's springing up all over northern Europe like thorny weeds, because there are just too many columns still standing, too many arches. There's too much exquisitely carved detritus cluttering up Italy for the classical to be totally obliterated. It's as if Italy spends most of the Middle Ages biding its time, waiting for the classical reboot it knows will one day be on the way. Several things combine to make that reboot happen. Most important of all, money. The economy booms in Florence, Urbino, Milan, and money, well, it actually percolates through society. So unlike their French or British cousins, the Italian peasantry starts to get a taste for the finer things that they see as in the gift of their swaggering despots. So the oligarchs, the Medici, the Sforza, the Gonzagas that rule their own particular roosts. And these oligarchs, like oligarchs the world even today, well, they wanted columns, and more columns that made them feel comfortingly like the new Caesar or this season's Augustus, time-defying emperors of style and taste. Emperors who, crucially, didn't get the gig because they were born to it. Like their Renaissance heirs, the rulers of ancient Rome were by and large bully boys, first past the potentators who controlled the army, who seduced the mob with bread and circuses. The other big factor in bringing back the classical, well, is the classical itself. At best forgotten, at worst expunged, the guidebooks to civilization, the texts on how to build aqueducts, make concrete, cure sickness, do difficult sums, plus the poetry, the comedies, and the noble tragedies. Suddenly, these texts flood back into Italy. Now, somehow, despite its bankrupt, decadent sloth, Constantinople, the last remaining crumb of the Christian Byzantine civilization, had managed to survive until 1453. Wow, who'd have thought? But come 1453, Mehmet the Conqueror seized this once great city and made it the jewel in the Ottoman turban. This unleashes a tide of intellectual refugees who've stripped Constantinople's libraries of the classical texts that had been kept hidden from the West for years, and they took them with them as they flee to the Italian peninsula. So now Italy had both the buck and the bang to bring back the classical. The other big bunk-up came with the rediscovery at this time of a long-lost book on architecture by Vitruvius. In it, he laid out a crystal-clear route map for architects to follow so that they could build just like the Romans built. All the do's, all the don'ts, including his cut-out and keep guide to the classical orders. Now, this was originally a Greek idea, but Vitruvius described in detail the rigid design essentials you would need to make columns in the 4 very particular flavours that the Romans used. They were Doric, actually the Romans called it Tuscan, Ionic, Corinthian, and the weird kind of cut and shunt known as composite. Each order was, he said, appropriate for specific architectural uses depending on the look you were after. So Doric, which is roughy and tufty and thought of as uber ancient, well, that was going to be great for bridges, prisons, and forts. Whilst Ionic, with those scrolls that looked like, scrolls, was perfect for libraries, law courts, places of learning. And Corinthian, plus its drag sister composite, were much more licentious, much more luxurious, making them perfect for pleasure palaces. Now, if there's one thing that the Romans weren't that good at architecturally, it's building high. They could build for miles and miles, literally, but they struggled to go beyond a few stories. For a start, making a column tall enough to go from bottom to top, thanks to the rules of classical proportion, or written down in Vitruvius, would require it to be so girthy you'd have no space for windows or doors, both of which are quite useful. So the Romans were forced instead to use ordinary size columns, but stack them up. And to post-rationalise this fundamental architectural inability, they came up with the idea that each column in the stack had to always be in chronological order. So Doric, the oldest, had to be at the bottom, whereas composite, the most up-to-date, was at the top. Now, for them, this gave everyone the impression that the building had grown upwards over time. Again, the column is doing so much more than just keeping the roof up. It's a much, much bigger story. As the Renaissance really warms up, some of its more daring designers, well, they start getting a bit jazzy. Michelangelo took Vitruvius rules and he bent them to the very limits of flexation. They almost snap. This inspires the next 2 or 3 generations of architects to curl, twirl, bend, and stretch classical columns like chewing gum. We call it Baroque, which in fact means absolutely nothing. It's a word that comes from the Portuguese for a misshapen pearl, barocco, and that sums it all up, really. Here, Sir John Vanbrugh makes classicism look as if it's got stuck in a photocopier. Actually, his design for Churchill's birthplace, Blenheim Palace, includes, well, a whole dressing up box of never-before-seen elements that have puzzled architectural historians for generations. Until, that is, they discovered that Vanbrugh spent 2 years in India. Basically, Vanbrugh brought more than a little Mogul exoticism to spice up the very stiff upper lip classicism. How very clever, how very theatrical, how very John Vanbrugh. There was one thing that everybody agreed upon, and that was that the dignity of classicism depended on the chaste whiteness of Roman marble. Only actually, it didn't. It was the rediscovery of Pompeii halfway through the 18th century that made all the difference. Scottish neoclassical architect and designer Robert Adam was one of the first to see at first hand that the Romans, actually, they loved colour. Preserved for centuries under the ash of Vesuvius, Adam saw that all the architectural details and enrichments everyone, since the Renaissance, had assumed had been elegant in stoic white, were actually meant to be very gaudy and often quite porny. He saw that the walls weren't uninterrupted plains of architectural understatement at all. They were in fact dense with lively, richly detailed murals. Inspired, Robert Adam gave the classical a newly decorative and decorated upgrade just at the time when the British landscape was getting vigorously speckled with a rash of column-fronted gentlemen's des reses. This was when the baton of classicism gets passed from Italia to Britannia, with the Brits who'd been newly empowered as the dominant players on the global trade stage, quick to see themselves as heirs to Rome's imperial might. They loved the fact that the Romans had been the only empire that had ever invaded them and dominated them. They had a strong nostalgia for those days. Britain might have been working hard on getting itself together to have an empire, but across the channel, the Brits' perma-frenemy France had got itself an emperor. And Napoleon, like the Medici before him and like Augustus before them, knew that if there's one thing that suits an imperial despot even more than a crown of laurel leaves, it's a forest of columns. Bonaparte was deeply talented at sniffing out the best, and when it came to classical mise-en-scène, Charles Percier and Pierre Fontaine were the Dolce & Gabbana of their age. Thanks to their emperor's conquests, they had the very best chisel to play with. From the ancient horses stolen from the facade of St. Mark's in Venice to the cream of Canova's contemporary classical carved crop. They draped the frankly unremarkable midget emperor in new clothes of such opulent classical magnificence, no one really twigged quite how unprepossessing he'd be without them. As well as the small matter of a protracted and bloody real war, Napoleon's trousseau kicked off a fast-escalating style war with Britain's Regent George. He craved some of the authoritative despot chic that Boney immersed himself in. As fat as Boney was short, Prinny hung earrings on classicism, creating a neo-Roman style that had all the showy impact of a Russian oligarch's third wife. From our perspective, in modern times, the classical comes with some uncomfortable associations. There's the lingering damp tweed odour of fogyism for a start. As limp as a schoolmaster's used handkerchief, the classicists of the 21st century never seem to do themselves any favours, which is actually a shame because a lot of their work really works. Quillan Terry, Anthony Brown, another Robert Adam, all make academically satisfying architectural statements for the benefit of country life readers. Whilst the defunct, disrespected postmodernist school now feels for us, well, inseparable from the cheap, mass-produced shopping malls it inspired, which is again a shame, because actually, Robert Venturi's Sainsbury wing at the National Gallery has very successfully mellowed into Trafalgar Square's cityscape. And there's Ricardo Bofill, who turned French housing estates into these extraordinary space-age colosseums. And I've got a tremendous soft spot for Cesar Pelle, who gave Kuala Lumpur a world-class glass architectural icon with his supremely elegant Petronas Towers. But from our perspective, from modern times, the classical elephant in the room is going to be fascism. Inevitably, Mussolini revelled in classicism. Under his aegis, a super chic, pared back, Armani-esque neo-Roman style for real Romans was evolved to sit shamelessly next to its ancient architectural ancestors. But cleverly, it stressed the importance of quality materials and exquisite tailoring, which is why it has survived to this day. Unlike the concrete behemoths that Hitler's blue-eyed boy Albert Speer dragged into unlovely existence to glorify his Führer and the Eternal Reich, no one batted an eyelid when they fell as Hitler fell, and no one has ever really owned up to missing them either. Speer's buildings simply had no aesthetics. They were just enormous, classical machines for Hitlering in. Big, bellicose bunkers that had columns for the sake of columns. In closing, I think I should now quote from our new mate Caesar. Veni, vidi, columna. I came, I saw, I columned.